A police officer beat Chuck Norris's daughter into a coma. He didn't know who her father was, but within a few days the whole country knew his name. What Chuck did shocked everyone. Watch until the end and write in the comments where you're watching us from. Don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun rose gently over Los Angeles, casting a golden hue across Millwood Park. Joggers trotted along the main path, their breaths steady in the cool spring air. A group of children shrieked with laughter near the fountains, and pigeons fluttered in flocks from tree to tree. Among the quiet bustle of early risers was 16-year-old Danielle Kelly Norris, the youngest daughter of Chuck Norris and his wife, Gina O'Kelly. She wore a gray hoodie over a navy sports bra, sleek black leggings, and running shoes that had seen just enough miles to crease comfortably around her toes. Her strawberry blonde curls were tied in a high ponytail, bouncing with each step. Slung around her torso was a small sling bag containing her water bottle and a portable battery pack. In one hand, she held her phone at eye level, live streaming her run to her modest but steadily growing group of social media followers. She was in the middle of talking about her upcoming gymnastics competition when she slowed down to catch her breath near the rose garden. Her voice was calm, her words measured, but her enthusiasm shone through her tone as she described her routine and how she wanted to make her father proud. She laughed when someone in the comments teased her about her Norris kicks being legendary already, and she jokingly replied, "Only one of us has black belts in 8 martial arts, and it's not me." Danielle wasn't the kind of teenager who flaunted her last name. In fact, she often avoided using it when she could. She liked the feeling of earning her own place, her own merit. Her friends knew who her father was, of course, but she never led with that. To them, she was Danny, sweet, determined, witty, a little too competitive, and someone who always stood up when another kid was being picked on. She had her father's discipline and her mother's gentleness, a mix that made her both strong and compassionate. That morning, she was simply enjoying a break from the rigor of school and training, savoring the quiet. It was just after 9 a.m. when Officer Brian Coulter spotted her near the edge of the park. He had been assigned to Millwood for the past 6 months after an administrative relocation that conveniently swept under the rug 2 civilian complaints, one for excessive force, another for racial profiling. Coulter, in his late 40s, was tall, thick-armed, and had the permanent scowl of someone who believed respect should be demanded, not earned. That morning, he had already barked at a homeless man, glared down a couple of teens for skating near the benches, and written a parking citation with a little too much relish. When he saw Danielle holding her phone and filming what he assumed was unauthorized, he instinctively felt threatened, as if being watched without his control diminished his authority. Coulter approached her with his hand resting on the strap of his baton. Danielle noticed him just as she paused her stream to change playlists. She offered a polite smile, thinking he was just patrolling. Instead, he barked, "What are you doing?" Danielle blinked. "Just filming my run. I'm on a live stream," she replied evenly. "You filming me?" he snapped. "No," she said quickly, holding the phone down and showing the paused app. "Just my route. I'm a high school athlete." "ID," he said. Danielle hesitated. She wasn't carrying her full wallet, only her school ID tucked into her phone case. She took it out and handed it over. He snatched it from her hands, examined it briefly, and scoffed. "You don't look 16, he muttered. I am. I go to Carson Prep. You can call them," she offered, now a little uneasy. "Turn around," Coulter said. "What?" I said, "Turn around. Hands behind your back." She froze. "I haven't done anything. I haven't broken any—" "Are you resisting?" he growled, stepping forward. "No, I'm not. Please, I don't understand." Before the words finished leaving her mouth, he grabbed her by the wrist, twisted her arm behind her back, and pushed her face forward toward the ground. She gasped, pain shooting through her elbow as it wrenched unnaturally. A gasp rippled through the nearby crowd. A man began recording. "Hey, she's a kid," someone shouted. Coulter didn't listen. His eyes were narrowed, jaw clenched. "Stay down," he roared as he forced his knee into her back. Danielle cried out, her voice muffled by the earth. "Please stop." He pulled his baton free. The first strike hit her thigh, the second cracked against her side. The third, worse, landed squarely on the back of her head. Her scream cut short, her body slackened. Blood pooled beneath her temple, darkening the dirt. A curl of hair matted to her cheek. Her fingers twitched once, then went still. The world around Coulter broke into chaos. Screams erupted. Someone lunged to stop him, only to be held back by another officer who had arrived seconds too late. Phones captured every angle. The teenage girl on the ground was no longer moving. A physics teacher, Mr. Patel, happened to be nearby walking his dog. He rushed forward, identifying himself and dropping to his knees beside her. He checked for a pulse. "She's not responsive," he said. "Call an ambulance now. She needs oxygen. She's slipping." A medic team arrived within minutes. Danielle was rushed into the ambulance, intubated before the doors even closed. The officer who had accompanied Coulter whispered something to him and quickly guided him out of the scene, trying to prevent further escalation. The footage hit the internet within the hour. The hashtags #Justice for Danielle and #Millwood Assault began trending. But none of that mattered in that moment when Gina O'Kelly's phone rang at home. Her heart stopped. The voice on the other end was clinical, rushed. "Mrs. Norris, your daughter has been admitted to Mercy General with severe head trauma. She is in critical condition." Gina barely heard the rest. Her hand trembled as she called her husband. Chuck Norris was at a charity auction in Orange County when the call came. The moment he heard his wife's voice crack, he knew something was wrong. "Danny," she choked. She's been hurt. A cop. In the park." He stood up silently from the table, his chair scraping back. The room around him blurred into a low hum of voices and clinking glasses. He walked out without speaking to anyone, ignoring the questions from event staff. He got into his truck, his face stone, his hands gripping the wheel like iron. He didn't need directions to the hospital. His daughter was there. That was all he needed to know. When Chuck arrived at Mercy General, the nurse at the front desk paled when she saw him. Wordlessly, she pointed toward the ICU. Gina met him at the entrance, her face streaked with tears. He wrapped his arms around her tightly, gently, then stepped into the sterile hallway that led to his daughter. Danielle lay on the bed, almost unrecognizable. Swelling distorted her features. Her left eye was bruised shut, a bandage wrapped around her skull. Monitors beeped in rhythm, blinking out numbers and lines that Chuck could only partially interpret, but all he knew was they meant she was still alive. The doctor, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, approached them quietly. "She has a closed head injury," she said, "cerebral swelling. We've placed her in a medically induced coma to reduce intracranial pressure. The next 72 hours are critical." Chuck didn't ask questions. He didn't rage. He didn't cry. He stood still, watching his daughter, and placed his hand lightly over hers. His thumb stroked the back of her hand in slow, steady circles. "Her phone?" he finally asked. "Confiscated," the nurse said. "The officer said it was evidence." He nodded once. Then he turned and left the room. Outside the ICU stood a female officer. She looked up as Chuck approached. "Were you one of them?" he asked, his voice low. The woman shifted uncomfortably. "No, sir. I'm just here for watch." "I didn't ask what you're doing now," he said. "I asked if you put your hands on my daughter." She looked away. Chuck said nothing more. He turned and walked down the hallway, his boots echoing against the tile. That night, after Gina fell asleep in the hospital chair, Chuck returned home alone. He went to the hall closet and reached behind the winter coats. He pulled out a long-forgotten duffel bag. Inside, his old flight suit lay folded with care, its navy fabric still smelling faintly of sand, jet fuel, and war. His call sign was stitched over the chest. Ghost. Not many people in L.A. knew that Chuck Norris had flown classified missions for the U.S. Air Force, or that he had once been a military instructor in close-quarters combat for elite operatives. Fewer still knew he had trained counterinsurgents overseas and led exercises alongside intelligence teams in war zones. But Chuck hadn't needed those skills in a long time. Now he did. And the man who put his daughter in a coma had no idea what he had awakened. The hospital hallway was hushed, the kind of silence that pressed in around the ears like water. Chuck sat alone outside the ICU, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped. Through the glass pane, he could see Danielle. Nothing had changed. Her chest rose and fell with mechanical rhythm. Her eyes remained closed, her body motionless beneath a white hospital sheet. The bruises on her face had darkened overnight, her left arm immobilized in a padded splint. Gina was asleep nearby, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, her head tilted back, mouth slightly open from exhaustion. Chuck hadn't moved in hours. He replayed it all in his mind. The call, the rushed drive, the machines, the blood caked in his daughter's curls. The helplessness was what burned most. Not the pain, not the anger. It was the stillness, the not knowing if she'd wake up, if he'd hear her laugh again, if he'd ever see her swing across the mats in the gym the way she used to. And underneath it all, something old was stirring in him, something he had buried long ago under the layers of peace and restraint. He knew the signs. He had trained others to suppress it. He had taught young men how to walk away from the edge. But now, as he looked through the glass at his little girl lying broken, he no longer wanted to step back. He stood and walked toward the elevator without a word. By the time the morning sun climbed above the city, Chuck was already in his garage. He hadn't opened that particular steel cabinet in nearly 15 years. He typed in the access code. The lock hissed, then clicked. Inside were files, contact numbers, photos, old credentials, and a single hard case lined with foam that housed one of the last remaining copies of his personnel file from his classified years. He took it all to his desk, spreading it out with the precision of a man reacquainting himself with a former life. On the table, he placed his laptop, opened a secure VPN connection, and started making calls. Some were to old contacts in the Air Force. Others were to former students who now worked in federal agencies or private security. Within a few hours, he had everything he needed on Officer Brian Coulter. Disciplinary reports, 2 internal investigations, both buried, multiple civilian complaints, and a high rate of use-of-force incidents, particularly involving young black males. In every case, Coulter had filed identical language in his reports. The suspect resisted. Officer feared for his safety. Force was necessary to neutralize. Chuck sat back, fingers steepled under his chin. He recognized a pattern. It wasn't just misconduct, it was behavior. Intentional, repeated, and worse, protected. Coulter wasn't a loose cannon. He was a man who had learned the system would not hold him accountable. And this time, he had picked the wrong child. Later that day, Chuck returned to the hospital. A nurse, wide-eyed, whispered that Coulter had been placed on administrative leave. No arrest, no charges, not even suspension. The hospital had turned over Danielle's phone to the department, citing protocol. Chuck made no comment. He walked past the nurse station, past the officer stationed at the ICU door, and into Danielle's room. The monitors beeped softly. A nurse adjusted an IV line. Gina looked up, saw his face, and knew he had begun. After making sure his wife had food and rest, Chuck returned home and entered his private gym. The space was large, utilitarian, with padded floors and high ceilings. A single heavy bag hung in the center. He removed his jacket, laced his gloves, and began to move. Each strike against the bag echoed with force, years of discipline channeling rage into technique. His kicks were sharp, fluid, controlled. His hands moved in tight, brutal combinations. Sweat poured down his neck. Muscles long dormant came alive. In between drills, his mind flashed to Afghanistan, where he had trained local forces under black-budget directives. Iraq, where he'd disarmed men twice his size in sand-choked villages. And D.C., where he once escorted a high-ranking diplomat through a riot zone without drawing his weapon. He had been many things in service of his country: soldier, instructor, ghost, but he had never wanted to be a weapon again. Until now. The following day, Chuck visited a private law office operated by one of his old contacts, a former JAG lawyer named Alan Graves. Graves had retired from military courts and now specialized in wrongful force cases. When Chuck entered the office, Alan raised an eyebrow. "You really want to go down this path, Chuck?" "She's my daughter," Chuck said. "What would you do?" Alan didn't argue. He pulled up police records on a secure server. Together, they reviewed footage, civilian uploads, police logs, and dispatch records. There were holes, timelines that didn't match, body cam files marked corrupted, and a suspicious lack of internal disciplinary notes in Coulter's personnel jacket. All of it reeked of protection. Alan leaned back, arms crossed. "You're dealing with something bigger than one cop. This goes higher." "I know," Chuck replied. "That's why I need to go deeper." He spent the next several nights contacting journalists he trusted, former Marines turned reporters, and cybersecurity experts who could track down leaked footage before it disappeared. One whistleblower sent him a series of internal memos from the LAPD, communications from precinct supervisors coaching officers on how to justify force and clean up public narratives before press coverage. The words suspect noncompliance appeared again and again. The picture was becoming clearer. Danielle wasn't just a victim. She was a witness to a larger rot, and now, unconscious, she couldn't speak for herself. Chuck would. He returned to the hospital with an external hard drive in his pocket and sat beside Danielle again. She hadn't moved. He reached out and took her hand gently. "I know you can't hear me, baby girl," he whispered, "but I'm going to make sure the world knows what they did to you, and I'm not stopping until they answer for every second of this." That night, he opened his old black duffel bag again, this time removing the Navy flight suit. He laid it across the bed, smoothing the fabric with reverence. Then he picked up a small velvet pouch, opened it, and poured a silver pin into his hand. An eagle, wings spread wide, clutching arrows. Beneath it, his old call sign. Ghost. He stared at it for a long time. The next morning, just after sunrise, Chuck walked into the downtown precinct. The front desk officer blinked as he looked up and saw who stood before him. "Ma'am," Chuck said to the receptionist, "call your captain. Tell him Chuck Norris is here." She hesitated. "Now?" 5 minutes later, Captain Drew Hastings descended the stairs. He hadn't seen Chuck in nearly 20 years. The man before him looked older, yes, but no less imposing. "Well, well," Hastings said, "didn't think I'd see you again." "You shouldn't have had to," Chuck said, "but your men put my daughter in the ICU." Hastings' expression tightened. "If this is a legal matter—" "I'm not here as a lawyer," Chuck said. "I'm here as a father." Hastings tried to maintain control. "We're still collecting body cam footage." "I've already seen it," Chuck interrupted. The room fell silent. Hastings blinked. "How?" Chuck didn't answer. He leaned in just slightly, his voice low, cold. "You have 48 hours. I want every name involved, every record, every complaint ever filed against Coulter. And I want to know why a girl was stopped without cause and left bleeding in a public park. Because if I don't get answers, I'll show you what a man with clearance, a war record, and nothing left to lose looks like." Hastings didn't respond. He didn't need to. Chuck turned and walked out, leaving only silence behind him. That night, Chuck drove to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a private facility used by military contractors. Inside waited Marcus Devereaux, a former intelligence analyst Chuck had worked with during an overseas mission. The man now specialized in open-source intelligence and data forensics. Chuck handed him a file with badge numbers. "I need everything you can find. Quietly." Marcus raised an eyebrow, then opened the file. "This one's been suspended twice. This one, Jesus, was involved in a shooting last year. Internal Affairs buried both." "Dig deeper," Chuck said. "You planning to take them to court?" "No," Chuck said. "I'm planning to take them apart." By dawn, Marcus had uncovered a web of data: internal reports, hidden complaints, social media patterns, and message board screenshots from officers discussing how to handle protesters. It was a digital minefield. Chuck took the files and scanned through them until his eyes burned. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was focused. The ghost had awakened, and war was coming. The world had no warning. The name Chuck Norris carried with it decades of mythology, jokes, and admiration. Most of America remembered him as the stoic hero on screen, the martial artist who made villains tremble and fans cheer. But those who truly knew him, who had trained with him, fought beside him, or crossed him, understood something the memes never captured. Chuck Norris, when awakened to a mission, was methodical, precise, and unstoppable. As Danielle remained unconscious in the hospital, her body fighting for every breath, Chuck prepared a different kind of fight. The evidence Marcus had uncovered was only the beginning. It painted a picture of a culture of violence protected by bureaucracy, emboldened by silence, and sustained by fear. Chuck knew the game. You didn't bring down a corrupt system by swinging wildly. You dismantled it piece by piece, with proof, with pressure, and, if necessary, with presence. He spent the next 48 hours compiling everything: the footage, the complaints, the names, the statistics, the statements of victims long ignored. Every redacted file Marcus decrypted revealed a deeper rot. Coulter wasn't an anomaly. He was a product of something bigger. He had been rewarded for his aggression, promoted after settlements were paid quietly, and shielded by captains more interested in optics than accountability. Chuck's next step wasn't physical. It was surgical. He reached out to a trusted journalist, Elena Vargas, an investigative reporter whose work had taken down state-level corruption and exposed abuses in foster care systems. When she answered his call and heard who was on the other end, she didn't believe it at first, but as soon as he shared a single clip, a 7-second body cam recording of Danielle being struck as she begged for help, she booked a flight to Los Angeles that same night. They met in a private office above a boxing gym Chuck had once co-owned. Elena arrived with a laptop, a camera crew, and a promise. Tell the story. All of it, without edits. Chuck didn't flinch. He sat before her, eyes hard, voice even. "My daughter's in a coma," he began, "because a man who shouldn't wear a badge was given one, because people who should have stopped him didn't. I'm not here to blame. I'm here to make sure this never happens again." The interview lasted an hour. Chuck spoke not just as a father, but as a veteran. He described patterns, explained systems of silence, and named names. He held up photos of Danielle from her competitions, her school science fair, her birthday party. Then he played the video. The internet exploded. The footage, coupled with Chuck's quiet fury and undeniable credibility, broke through every political divide. In under 6 hours, the clip had 20 million views. Celebrities, senators, veterans, athletes, people from every corner of the country began to share it with one line. "This isn't just Chuck Norris's daughter. This is every daughter." Protests erupted in Los Angeles. Peaceful at first, then angrier as more details surfaced. Parents marched with their children, holding signs that read, "I am Danielle, police reform now," and "If it was your daughter." Coulter, still technically an officer, was placed on paid administrative leave. But Chuck wasn't satisfied. He didn't want him hidden. He wanted him held accountable. That's when Chuck made his most controversial move. On a Saturday morning, with crowds already gathering downtown, Chuck drove to Millwood Park. He wasn't in a suit or a uniform. He wore jeans, boots, and a plain black t-shirt. No cameras followed him. No security detail trailed behind. He came alone, the way he had come into battle all his life, ready. Coulter was there. Despite the storm brewing around him, he'd returned to his old patrol route as if nothing had happened. Some said it was arrogance. Others claimed it was a show of power, a message that he was untouchable. Whatever the motive, it was a mistake. Chuck found him near the East Fountain, leaning against his cruiser, coffee in hand. Coulter looked up, saw him, and smiled in that slow, smug way that people smile when they think they're still in control. "Well," he said, "if it isn't America's favorite cowboy." Chuck didn't answer. He stopped 10 feet away, hands at his sides. "You shouldn't be here," Coulter added. "It's an active investigation." Chuck's voice was calm. "You shouldn't be on the street." Coulter shrugged. "Internal Affairs cleared me for patrol. Besides, it was an unfortunate situation." She resisted. The air shifted. "She was 16, Chuck said. She was aggressive. She weighs 120 pounds. I felt threatened." There it was. The same phrase used to justify every broken nose, every bloody mouth, every corpse in a body bag. Chuck stepped forward. "You're not gonna touch me," Coulter said, suddenly less sure of himself. Chuck's response was a blur. It wasn't a punch, it wasn't rage, it was a precise, disciplined maneuver, the kind designed to incapacitate without killing. A sweep of the leg, a twist of the wrist, and Coulter's baton clattered to the ground. In 3 seconds, he was on his knees, his arm locked behind his back in a hold so clean it could have been taught in a dojo. Civilians screamed. Phones rose. Someone shouted, "It's Chuck Norris!" And the crowd surged forward. Chuck didn't strike again. He stood over Coulter, looking down, breathing steady. "This is what restraint looks like," he said for the cameras. Then he stepped back. Police arrived within minutes. One young officer tried to approach Chuck with handcuffs, but his superior stopped him with a gesture. Coulter, humiliated, was placed into the back of a different cruiser, silent, eyes burning. By nightfall, the footage of the park confrontation had overtaken every news cycle. But it wasn't just spectacle. It was message. A man who had built a life on strength had used it not for vengeance, but for proof. He had shown the world what real discipline looked like, and, in doing so, he had destroyed the narrative that Coulter had tried to spin. The mayor of Los Angeles called an emergency press conference. Chuck was invited to attend. He declined. He wasn't interested in political theater. Instead, he sat with Gina in the hospital cafeteria, watching as networks replayed the moment over and over. His phone vibrated with messages, calls from Washington, Hollywood, even from international media. He answered none of them. He had only one priority. He returned to Danielle's bedside just after midnight. The machines still beeped. Her hand was still warm. He spoke softly. "They saw you, baby. The whole world did. And they're not going to forget." The following morning, the LAPD announced a full internal review. Captain Hastings was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Officer Brian Coulter was suspended without pay, but Chuck knew better than to celebrate. Bureaucracy was a slow-moving beast, and systems didn't crumble overnight. That's when the letters started. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. Emails, physical notes, voicemails, from parents, from students, from officers, from nurses. One letter from a woman in Georgia read, "My son didn't survive. I wish we had someone like you when it happened." Chuck read every single one and began compiling them, documenting patterns, identifying recurring names, precincts, tactics. He wasn't building a case anymore. He was building a blueprint, not for vengeance, for change. But deep inside, he still carried the weight of Danielle's silence, the weight of her stillness. Until she woke up, nothing else mattered, and he would wait as long as it took. The hospital lights never changed. Days passed in a blur of sterile white and the quiet rhythm of machines. Danielle remained motionless, her body healing in ways only time could reveal. But while her world stayed still, the one outside her window had turned into a storm. The footage from Millwood Park, both the brutal beating and Chuck's quiet takedown of Officer Coulter, had detonated a national conversation. Social media continued to boil. Television panels rotated hourly guests, and everywhere, in living rooms and classrooms and police stations, people were asking the same question. How could this have happened to her? Chuck hadn't left the hospital since that morning. He slept in a chair, ran his briefings from a visitor's conference room, and only showered at home in brief returns. Gina rarely left her daughter's side, reading to her, brushing her hair, whispering into her ear in case, by some miracle, Danielle could still hear. It was in these quiet hours that Chuck reviewed files, recorded statements, and planned his next steps. Elena Vargas's story had done more than light a fire. It had drawn blood. Inside the LAPD, internal tensions were building. Captain Hastings, now suspended, had gone silent. But leaks were springing from inside the department. Junior officers, civilian employees, and even disillusioned detectives were reaching out to Chuck's team anonymously. Most came with documents. Some brought footage. One came with a conscience. Officer Harold Rhee had served in the LAPD for nearly 20 years. A quiet man, biracial, with a sharp eye and a guilt that had taken root long ago. He had served under Hastings and had seen how men like Coulter were promoted. He knew the meetings, the codes, the subtle nods during roll calls when officers were told to remind troublemakers who's in charge. It had never been said outright, but Ree remembered one phrase that echoed in every briefing room: "Don't be the next headline. Make sure your report is tight." Ree contacted Chuck directly. They met after hours at a church gymnasium where Chuck often volunteered. Ree didn't come in uniform. He brought with him an envelope, a flash drive, and a look that said he had finally had enough. "I was a coward," Ree said, "but not anymore." Inside the envelope was a printed email dated 6 months earlier, signed by Hastings. It was a memo circulated among supervisors instructing officers to double presence in minority-heavy school zones and contain non-compliance swiftly to avoid escalation. The language was sterile. The meaning was not. Chuck read it twice. Then he looked up at Ree. "Will you testify?" Ree nodded slowly. "But you'll need to protect my family." "You have my word," Chuck said. Ree's decision changed everything. Elena broke the story the next day, carefully omitting his identity but quoting from the internal memo. Within hours, legal teams from civil rights organizations flooded Chuck's inbox, offering pro bono support. Federal agents made unofficial contact. Even members of Congress tweeted their outrage, calling for a full Justice Department probe. At City Hall, the mayor called a press conference to address public concern. Chuck stood at the back, arms folded, silent. He had no intention of participating in political theater, but he listened as the mayor promised a thorough independent review and transparency moving forward. The words tasted hollow. After the event, Chuck approached the podium uninvited, with a thick folder under his arm. Security moved toward him until one of the mayor's aides whispered who he was. The mayor stepped back. Chuck took the microphone. "My daughter," he began, "was not a mistake. What happened to her wasn't bad luck. It was a pattern, a system. And this," he held up the folder, "proves it." He opened the folder and pulled out copies of signed non-disclosure agreements from past victims who had been paid off. He showed internal memos instructing officers on what phrases to use in reports to avoid investigations. He displayed printed complaints that never reached supervisors, all filed against Coulter and other officers like him. "I'm giving you 72 hours, Chuck said, "to arrest the men who did this, to begin a federal investigation, and to fire anyone involved in covering it up. If you don't, I will release every page to the press, every email, every file." The room erupted. Reporters screamed questions. The mayor looked ashen. Chuck stepped down without answering a word. That night, someone broke into Chuck's home. They didn't make it far. Otis Langley, a former Navy SEAL who had worked with Chuck in Central America decades ago, had been standing on the property for security. He caught the intruder in the hallway, a masked man with gloves and a small crowbar. Otis took him down in 6 seconds and held him at gunpoint until police arrived. The man's name was Thomas Dre, a civilian precinct contractor with ties to Hastings' office. Upon arrest, he had no identification, but inside his van were shredded documents, burner phones, and surveillance photos of Chuck, Gina, and even Danielle's hospital room. Chuck didn't sleep that night. He watched the surveillance feeds frame by frame, then reviewed hospital records. That's when he noticed it. The medical file on Danielle had been altered. A section detailing the location and severity of her cranial trauma had been redacted, replaced with a note suggesting a possible seizure history that neither Chuck nor Gina had ever heard mentioned before. He called Dr. Klein, the neurologist on duty. "I never wrote that," the doctor said. "That's not my note, and she has no history of seizures." They had tried to erase the evidence from her body. Chuck's hands shook, not from fear, but from fury restrained. He contacted Elena and ordered a full release. All the documents. Every file Marcus had uncovered, every witness statement, every scan of Danielle's bruised skull, every quote from Officer Ree, every training manual reference that suggested escalation over de-escalation. The story published at dawn. The public reaction was instantaneous and violent in tone. Nationwide protests ignited. In Atlanta, mothers marched in front of City Hall holding pictures of their children. In Chicago, officers began to step forward with their own stories. In Denver, school teachers organized walkouts in Danielle's name. The hashtag #WhereDanielle dominated social feeds, joined by #GhostAwake and #CleanTheBadges. Back in Los Angeles, Chuck sat with Danielle. Her eyes remained closed, but her heartbeat was strong. Nurses told him her oxygen levels were stable. That was all he needed to hear. He picked up her hand. "They tried to rewrite what happened to you," he whispered. "But we wrote louder." When the FBI arrived that evening to interview him, Chuck handed over physical copies of all evidence. They asked him to come to D.C. to testify. He agreed, but he had one condition. "I won't go," he said, "until she wakes up." 2 days later, while Chuck was reading aloud from Danielle's favorite book, her fingers twitched. He froze. Gina looked up from her chair. The nurse at the monitors leaned in, eyes widening. Then Danielle's lips moved. A faint sound escaped. Chuck stood up, tears threatening to break. "Danielle," he said softly. "Baby girl, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, unfocused, flickering. Then, with great effort, she whispered one word. "Dad?" The machines beeped faster. Nurses flooded in. Gina sobbed. Chuck grabbed her hand and pressed it to his lips, overcome with emotion for the first time since the beginning. She was alive. The next morning, Chuck stood outside the hospital before a forest of microphones. He held up one of Danielle's shoes, a simple white sneaker stained with blood. He placed it on a small white stool beside him. "My daughter," he said, "has opened her eyes. But that does not mean we are finished. Every single person who shared her story, who protested, who stood up, thank you. But now comes the harder part, the part where we don't stop." He looked into the cameras. "We are not going away. We are not backing down, and we will not be silent." Across the city, in a quiet room, Officer Coulter sat watching the news. His lawyer paced behind him, muttering strategies. But Coulter knew. Deep down, he knew. They weren't going to win this time. And Chuck wasn't done. The applause in the federal courtroom had long since faded, replaced by the quiet murmur of reporters scribbling notes and the solemn breathing of families who had waited too many years to hear what they had just heard. Chuck stood outside, the sunlight glinting off the marble steps of the courthouse, a light breeze tugging at the sleeve of his suit. His shoulders were squared, his face unreadable. Around him, people gathered, not as a mob, not as fans, but as witnesses, the kind who had lived through similar stories. Mothers, fathers, children. Some held photos of their own lost loved ones. Others held signs bearing Danielle's face or the words, "Truth is not a threat." Danielle's testimony was not needed. The evidence had been overwhelming. Still, she had insisted on coming to the courthouse, not to speak, but to be seen. Her presence, fragile but defiant, sent a message louder than any speech. She sat in the front row beside Gina, her body still recovering, her face marked by healing bruises, but her eyes were alive, alert, watching. Chuck glanced back at the doors. For a long moment, he simply breathed. The journey had stretched him in ways even war never had. This had not been a mission he volunteered for. It had been forced upon him with the swing of a baton and the silence of a child's unconscious body. But now that it was here, now that justice had begun its slow march, he wasn't stepping aside. The indictment of Officer Brian Coulter had shaken the LAPD, but what followed had uprooted it. The federal probe had uncovered a string of abuses going back over a decade, each one buried beneath paperwork, hidden by settlement clauses, or brushed away by supervisors who feared political fallout more than the truth. Captain Hastings was found guilty of obstruction, along with several senior staff members who had overseen the systematic suppression of complaints and doctored internal reviews. In total, 27 officers were either fired or indicted. Federal oversight was imposed on the department. Body cam policies were rewritten at the state level, and statewide legislation was introduced mandating independent investigations into any use of force involving minors. The bill was called the Danielle Act, but Chuck didn't stop. Even as Danielle began walking again, even as her voice returned with a whisper that slowly found its strength, he continued the work. In the weeks that followed, he traveled to schools, churches, town halls, not as an action star, not even as a public figure, but as a father, as a man who had seen what silence cost and refused to pay it again. He launched the Norris Foundation for Public Accountability, a nonprofit focused on monitoring law enforcement misconduct, supporting whistleblowers, and offering legal aid to victims. Within a month, the foundation had over 10,000 donors and partnerships with 5 national legal organizations. Otis became head of security and field response. Elena joined the advisory board. Officer Harold Ree, no longer with the LAPD, accepted a full-time role as community liaison. The ripple effect spread beyond California. In Seattle, a local mother reopened her son's case with support from the foundation. In New York, a teenager falsely arrested during a protest had her charges dropped after Chuck's legal team presented suppressed footage. In Chicago, a coalition of teachers and police officers held a joint forum, the first of its kind, on student rights and use of force prevention. Danielle, still undergoing therapy, watched all of it from home. She sat in a wheelchair by the window, laptop balanced on her knees, reading emails sent by girls her age from across the country. One read, "When I grow up, I want to be like your dad." Another, "Your voice woke up mine." She cried sometimes, but not from sadness. It was a strange, heavy joy of knowing that what had been meant to silence her had instead amplified thousands. Chuck came home late most nights. He would peek into her room, see her reading or sketching, and smile softly. They didn't talk much about the attack anymore. They didn't have to. Everything they needed to say lived between them in quiet glances, in the way his hand always rested gently on her shoulder when he passed, and in the way she looked at him with a new, deeper understanding. She had grown up in weeks. So had he. One morning, as Chuck prepared to leave for a meeting with federal legislators in Sacramento, Danielle stopped him at the door. "I want to go," she said. He turned, startled. "To the meeting?" She nodded. "Not to speak, just to sit in the room. They should see me." He studied her for a moment, then smiled. "Okay." They traveled together in silence, Gina seated beside them, Otis driving. When they arrived, the Capitol building loomed large, but Danielle didn't flinch. She walked slowly, leaning on a cane, each step measured but firm. Inside the chamber, senators, aides, and public figures turned when they entered. Chuck stood at the podium delivering prepared remarks about systemic reform, civil liberties, and policy enforcement. But no one listened to him more closely than they watched the young woman seated behind him. The bill passed. Afterward, back at home, Danielle returned to the piano for the first time since the attack. Her fingers were stiff, but she played the opening notes of a song she'd loved since childhood. Chuck stood in the doorway, listening. She looked up. "I'm not scared anymore," she said. He walked to her and sat beside her on the bench. "Neither am I." It was the first peace they had both known in months. Weeks later, at a community event in downtown Los Angeles, Chuck took the stage for what had been advertised as a closing speech. The auditorium was packed with families, students, police officers, teachers, and reporters. Behind him was a screen filled with the names of those affected by excessive force. In the center, Danielle's name, not as a victim, but as a survivor. Chuck didn't use the teleprompter. "I didn't come here to become a symbol," he said, "and I certainly didn't come to become your enemy, though some would paint me that way. I came because when my daughter was nearly killed for walking while young and free, something inside me cracked, and something bigger inside me woke up." He paused, letting the room absorb his words. "This isn't just about one officer or one department. It's about every time we were told to look away. Every time someone said, 'It's just procedure.' It's not. It's not justice when someone dies in handcuffs. It's not order when fear keeps kids from walking home." He turned and pointed to the screen. "This is who we fight for." The room erupted into applause. Some wept. Some simply stood in silence. Later that night, in a private boardroom in the LAPD headquarters, the newly appointed interim commissioner, Russell Maynard, addressed a room of stone-faced commanders. He slammed a thick folder onto the table. The air was tense. "We've got a federal audit breathing down our necks," he said. "Half the city council is demanding reforms yesterday. Our email servers are crawling with subpoenas. And you want to know the worst part?" He held up a flyer. On it was Chuck Norris's face beside the words, "Justice is just the start." "He's running for city council." There was a long silence. Captain Irene Talbot, recently demoted but still present, scoffed. "Good. Let him play politics. Gets him out of our hair." But another officer, Lieutenant Drew Folsom, shook his head. "You don't get it," he said. "He's not playing. He's winning." No one argued. Outside, the city pulsed with quiet change. Back in the hospital, now transformed into a rehab center, Danielle sat propped against pillows, scrolling through photos of murals painted across the city. One showed her standing strong, angel wings behind her, eyes open, mouth closed in quiet defiance. Another depicted Chuck, arms crossed, standing between a line of riot police and a group of peaceful children. Danielle smiled, then turned her phone toward her father. "Did we win?" she asked. Chuck wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We made them see us," he said. "That's the first win. The rest, we keep fighting for." He looked out the window, the skyline lit in warm twilight. And for the first time in a long time, the city felt awake, alive, watching, and ready. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos for more powerful stories and share this one with someone who needs to see it. Your voice helps keep the truth alive.